The following program is brought to you by the friends and partners of Andrew Wommack Ministries, celebrating 50 years of sharing God's unconditional love and grace.
One of my favorite teachings from Andrew Wommack is don't limit God. That keeps me going, to know that every day I can wake up and God's going to use little me in a big way.
Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, a teaching ministry that focuses on God's unconditional love and grace. And now, Andrew continues teaching from the life-changing Word of God about Don't Limit God.
Welcome to our Monday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing a series that I've entitled Don't Limit God. And I tell you, this has transformed my life. And if you've been listening to this, and if you've received what I've said, I know that this will change your life. I consider the time that the Lord spoke to me, January the 31st, 2002, as the second most important encounter I ever had with the Lord, outside of just being born again. But March the 23rd, 1968 is where the Lord really revealed Himself to me, and I mean that drastically changed my life. And then January the 31st, 2002, the Lord spoke to me through Psalm 78:41 and said I was limiting Him by my small thinking. And it has revolutionized our life. You know, as I was coming into the office today, it's hard to measure things because the ministry isn't about buildings or about money or all of these things, but those are the easiest to measure. The ministry is actually about changing people's lives. And that's harder to measure because not everybody tells me what happens. I don't know and I don't remember all of that. But just in terms of assets, I was thinking about this. When the Lord spoke to me in 2002 that I was limiting Him by my small thinking, just in the term of assets, the building that we owned at that time, and it was paid for, was less than $200,000. Was our total physical assets. And if you add, maybe some of our equipment and other things, there might have been a few more. But now our assets are well over $100 million. That is just phenomenal. $200,000 to $1 million would be 5 times an increase, and then 100 times that. We are now 500 times greater in assets. And like I said, that's really not what the ministry is about, but it's just one indication that when the Lord spoke to me and said I was limiting Him, I mean, it just blew the lid off of everything. It has radically changed my ministry, my outreach, and the same thing will happen for you. I really believe that we limit God by our small thinking. So I've talked about this for 2 weeks. This is the beginning of my 3rd week. I've given a lot of things about this. What we were talking about at the end of last week is how that I limited God because I'd finally got to a place to where we were succeeding to the degree that I no longer was facing crisis all of the time. We had doubled from January of 2000 to January of 2002. I was comfortable. And so one of the reasons that I was limiting God is because I wasn't stretched anymore. And I was kind of enjoying just goofing off. I guess you could call it laziness, or if you want to be politically correct or more sensitive, I was just comfortable and didn't want to look forward to being stretched again. I was fearful of the rejection that would come with it. I know that as you become a greater leader, you get exposed more, that you get more criticism, and I didn't like criticism. If you like criticism, I think something's wrong with you. Amen. I didn't like it, but I was fearful about being criticized. I was fearful about being examined more and all of these kind of things. And here's something I want to talk about today, and this is going to shock some of you because most people have never thought they were fearful of this, but I was fearful of success. And I know a lot of people think, man, I wouldn't be fearful of success. People want success. But here's the reason. And I'm going to show you some scriptural examples of this, but there are many examples. I bet you that every person watching this program can remember somebody who started out pure, who started out sincere, their motives were right, but then when success comes, it ruins them. The scripture says in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18, that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. When you get lifted up in pride, I guarantee you it's just a matter of time until you crash and burn. There's so many scriptures on this. Proverbs 8:13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogancy, and every evil way do I hate. And because of my knowledge of the Word, and because I've seen these examples of people that got lifted up in pride, I realized that if the Lord increased our ministry and gave me more influence and we started reaching more people, I realized that one of the real dangers was getting lifted up in pride, somehow or another thinking that I had done this. And I just hated the thought of that. In a sense, it was secure. Being relatively small, I didn't have to deal with those same issues. And this was a real issue with me. And again, I know that most people don't fear that. Most people, man, will take success and any of the problems that come with it, they just are all embracing it. But I have seen how people have been destroyed by pride. For instance, let me give you an example. And I'm not going to take the time to turn to all of these scriptures, but if you go to 1 Samuel, chapter 10 is where Saul came on the scene, and Saul was a very humble guy. He was the biggest man in all of Israel. It says that he was taller than any other person from the shoulders upwards. That meant that the next tallest person only came up to his shoulder. He was a huge figure of a man relative to the day. And yet he was a very humble guy. He was timid and shy. And when they went to anoint Saul to be king, they went through this great procession where Samuel had all of the leaders of the 12 tribes come by, and he chose the tribe of Benjamin. And then he had all of the leaders of the individual families come by, and he chose the family of Kish. And then he had all of the people in Kish's family come by, and he chose Saul, and he went through this great elaborate procession to anoint Saul. And when they called for Saul, he wasn't there. And they couldn't find him. And Samuel actually had to have a word of knowledge from the Lord, and they found him hiding amongst the stuff. He was in like a basket or something. And this was the guy that they were going to make king. But see, I don't know humble is the right word, but he certainly wasn't arrogant. He was shy, he was timid, and the people resented him. But then the anointing of God came upon him. He brought deliverance to the Jews and won victories, and boy, people began to rally behind Saul. And as he began to prosper, he got to where he did things his own way. And here in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel, Samuel had given Saul a command to go and destroy the Amalekites. And there's reasons for that. I won't go into all of this, but it was a proper thing. It was the judgment of God upon these people who had terrorized the Israelites. And he told them to kill the men, the women, the children, and the animals. Did you know, from our perspective, we think that was brutal, and how could a loving God do that? In the Old Testament, people could not be delivered from demons. And once you get into bestiality, and they were offering their children as sacrifices to these pagan gods, these people were demon possessed. Even their animals, because they were having sex with the animals. That was a common practice. And it was like today, if you have a cancer in your body or something, we don't have a cure for cancer. What they do is cut that cancer out, and they'll even take off parts of your body in an attempt to get rid of that cancer, and it's terrible on that part of your body. Let's say you had an infection or something in your hand, but people will actually amputate a hand or a leg or something, and it's terrible for the hand and for the leg, but for the body as a whole, it's an act of mercy. You're trying to preserve that person's life. Well, in a sense, that was comparable. These people could not be delivered of these demons. There was no cure before Jesus came and brought us deliverance from the devil. So once a person was given over to this demon possession, in a sense, the only way you could do was just kill it, cut it out. And so God said, go kill the Amalekites, men, women, children, animals, everything. And Saul did not obey. They saved the best of the women. They brought them back for their own wives. They saved the best of the animals, because it was a tradition that if you won a battle, that you offered animal sacrifices in thanksgiving to God. And rather than take their own animals and sacrifice them, they decided they would take some of the best of the Amalek's animals and sacrifice them, so it'd be no loss to themselves, which was totally wrong. And so anyway, Saul said he had obeyed what God told him to do, but Samuel said, well, then if you've obeyed, what meaneth? Let me just go back and read some of this. In verse 13, it says, Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said unto him, Blessed be thou of the Lord, I have performed the commandments of the Lord. And Samuel said, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? In other words, he says, I've done what God told me to do. God says kill all of the animals, and yet he could hear the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen. He says, well, if you perform God's will, how come I hear all of these animals? And here's Saul's answer. Saul said, they have brought them from the... Again, see, this is so classic. He refused to take responsibility for his actions. Saul was the king, and yet when he was criticized over his actions, well, they did this. No, Saul was in control. It was under Saul's leadership. It was with his permission that they did this, but he wouldn't own up to what he had done. So Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said unto Saul, Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord said unto me this night. And he said unto him, Say on. And Samuel said, When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? And then he goes on and talks about how he went ahead and disobeyed him. But the whole key to this was, when he was little in his own sight, God exalted him. You know, if we humble ourselves, God will exalt us. But when you get lifted up with pride, Proverbs 16:18, then comes destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. I've seen this with so many people. Matter of fact, there was a church here in Colorado Springs at the time, back in 1980 when I moved here. It was the only church that I was aware of that was really, full gospel. There were other spirit-filled churches, but I'm talking about the full gospel, charismatic move. They were the only ones that were kind of going in that stream. The others were the old Pentecostal type that basically rejected all of the charismatic stuff. So anyway, when we first came to Colorado Springs, we hooked up with this church, and the pastor of that church was a very humble guy, and because he was humble, he was preaching the right message and stuff. I mean, the church just began to explode. It went from just, a few dozen people to hundreds of people, up towards 1,000 people. And the thing just exploded in a relatively short period of time. And I remember that they outgrew their facility, so they got this old building, they remodeled it, and the very first service in that building, the pastor got up and started saying, look what we have done. It wasn't look what God has done, it's look what we have done. And he started just bragging and proclaiming his own goodness, and it was very offensive to me. And I actually got up and gave a prophecy and quoted this verse and said, when you were little in your own eyes, God exalted you. And then I quoted Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And I just warned the people. I said, look, the glory goes to God. And yes, God used us. And yes, we've cooperated, but the glory goes to God. And I just warned the people. It was not well received. Matter of fact, I wound up having to leave that church, not over that one issue, but we were just going different directions. And the long and the short of it is that the guy stole money. The administrator went to prison, is still in prison. The man lost his family, divorced, and the pastor of that is actually dead today. And I can guarantee you that the change happened when he began to start being lifted up in pride. I've seen success destroy more people than failure and problems ever did. I would say that the average person believes that if you are under pressure and when everything's going wrong, that'll really prove what you're like. I don't believe that's accurate. Now, I believe that is a test, and there are a lot of people that fall by the wayside when pressure comes because they never were committed. But for people who have any degree of commitment to God, when the pressure is on, when you're facing destruction, the average person will seek the Lord when there's no other way out. And I mean, let me just ask you, when is it that you pray the most? Is it when everything's going good or when everything's going bad? When the doctor has told you you're going to die, most people will begin to seek the Lord more than they did when they were totally well. Most people will seek the Lord when they're facing financial destruction more than they will when everything's going good. Most people pray more, seek the Lord more, are more dependent upon God when the pressure is on than when everything's going good. So I actually believe that the greatest test of your faith is not adversity, but it's prosperity. And you can go back through church history and I believe verify this. We actually teach a course in our Bible school on 2,000 years of charismatic church history, and we go back through history. And I mean, if you study history, every time that the church was persecuted, they grew. Their influence grew. The commitment of the people became stronger, and because of it, the gospel grew and expanded. But like in 300 and something AD, when they actually put the stamp of approval on Christianity and quit persecuting it, and they began to start making it the religion of the Roman Empire, boy, the church entered into a period of falling away, apostasy and stuff, because they were no longer under that pressure. Now, I'm not saying that God sent the pressure, but I'm saying that when people recognize that, man, the only way out is God, even people with a minimal commitment will turn to the Lord when they're under pressure. But the greatest temptation is when everything is going good, when there's no restraints on you, when you no longer have to seek God, when death or destruction is no longer imminent. Are you going to seek God as strong? And I would say that the vast majority of people would say no. The vast majority of people seek the Lord more when there's problems in their life than they do when there's prosperity. And so for that reason, I have seen people destroyed, more people destroyed by success than I ever have by failure. And so I've said all of these things to say that one of the reasons I was limiting God was because I feared success. I feared that if our ministry grew and if we had greater influence, that I would get lifted up in pride and that I would begin to start losing my relationship with God. And I know that most people don't even think this way, but I'm just telling you, that was a major fear to me. When I dealt with all of the other things, and I finally decided that, you know what, I'm not going to be lazy. I'm not just going to stay where it's comfortable. I'm going to go for it. And then when I decided, all right, I'll put up with the criticism. I'll put up with the increased scrutiny and people criticizing and attacking me. I'll put up with all of this. And when I passed all of those hurdles, the last thing that was a real hindrance to me was that I was actually afraid that if the Lord increased the ministry and increased my influence, that I wouldn't be as dependent upon Him, that I'd turn away from Him and I'd lose my relationship with the Lord that I'd developed for 34 years. 2002 was 34 years after my experience with the Lord where He changed my life. And I had a great relationship with the Lord, and I was fearful that I'd depart from it. I was fearful that success would change my attitude towards things. And man, that was a major deal to me. And I can truthfully say this, that I would rather have my relationship with the Lord, my closeness with the Lord, than I would rather have any of the buildings, any of the people that we've reached, the number of television stations, the calls that come in, the materials that go out, any of these other things. To me, it's all about relationship with the Lord, not about these other things. And that was a major problem for me. It was actually the last hurdle that I had to cross before I just said, all right, Father, I will not limit you. I'll go ahead. And one of the things that happened was, as I was praying about this, and I began to realize that I was afraid of success, and I was afraid that success might make me less dependent upon God. When I realized that, I was praying about this, and the Lord just spoke to me, and He said, Andrew, I have spent 34 years training you. And He says, I have prepared you for this, and you're just going to have to trust me in this the way that you've trusted me in other things. And so again, it was a step of faith. And you know, I can truthfully say today that my relationship with the Lord, I believe, is stronger and better than it's ever been, and that God has been faithful. It's now been 16 years since I had that encounter with the Lord on January the 31st of 2002. 16 years, and I can say that, man, my relationship with God is stronger, it's deeper, it's better today than it was then, and that, you know what, I can trust God. Now, I'm not lazy, or I'm not complacent thinking, well, I don't have to deal with this anymore. I know that Satan is constantly coming and trying to devour us, and one of the ways that he does it, if you look over there in 1 Peter chapter 5, where it says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. And people just take that verse out of context, and it is true that your adversary, the devil, is like a roaring lion, but put it in its context. Look up here in verse 6, it says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. And if you were to go up another verse, it says, God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all of your care upon him, because he careth for you. And then it says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, goes about seeking whom he may devour. And so in the context, it's talking about pride. And again, I believe that this is Satan's biggest inroad into our life, is us just exalting ourselves, getting independent of God to where we think we can make it. And that was my greatest fear, was a fear of success. And that was the last thing I had to deal with. I believe that there's probably some people watching this program that God is speaking this to you. You just are afraid that somehow or another, if you do succeed, if your visions come to pass, that somehow or another you'll lose something with the Lord. And I'm telling you that you need to pass over that fear too and trust God that he can keep you. He not only can put his vision on the inside of you, but he can keep you faithful to that.